Does anyone need a stretch? I'm sitting there and I was reflecting to myself. I said, I've been given the job of saying something interesting and keeping an audience engaged about half an hour before dinner and pints. And after they've been sitting in the same chairs in the same room for an hour and 55 minutes. So here we go. I wasn't going to start with a story, but I will. And it goes to the heart of the institutional failure. There was spoken a lot about this morning, and there was spoken a lot about already today. And it was a taxi. I was getting a taxi to the airport, and we were driving past Enniskerry. And the taxi driver, this was last year, we were kind of lamenting the state of the nation and everything that had happened. And the taxi driver said, he's from Newtown, Mount Kennedy, and he said, I've got a story for you that sums it up and that someday you're going to be able to use. So this is it. I haven't used it before. He said, so he has a gun, right? He shoots deer or whatever he shoots legally in Wicklow. And you have to have a gun license, and you have to renew your gun license. So he said he went into the local Garda station. He had gone in, I think, about a month before I got into his taxi. And the local sergeant said, well, Peter, you're going to have the form signed by a notary that says you are a good and decent person and that you're okay to carry firearms. And he said, fine. He said, well, who should I get? And he said, well, you can get a local TD. And he said they kind of looked at each other and said, hardly in a position to be saying who are good and decent people. Who else? And the sergeant said, we could get the local priest. And they sort of looked at each other. And he said, no, who else? And he said, what about the bank manager? And they kind of looked at each other. And he said, you're going to have to give me somebody. And he said, the only person left on the list, believe it or not, is the local Garda sergeant. And they kind of looked at each other. And I thought it encapsulated the whole thing beautifully. We've had this total collapse of institutional Ireland, this thing that Frank was saying Fine Gael, commit themselves to trying to protect. It has collapsed all around us. And we're looking at a subset of that today. And at McGill this year, and as Pat said, thank you very much, Pat, that was a private comment, I am a McGill virgin. And I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Joe very much for having me. So the question we're debating now in this session is, has the political landscape changed utterly? And the short answer is no, but it might. And there's two struggles going on. And the note that came with the McGill, it's in the brochure, the note that came with this session broke this question down very usefully into two questions. The first one is, are we seeing a realignment of Irish politics? And I think that's what a lot of what has been spoken about so far. But it also asked a second question, which is where I'm going to spend more of my time, which is, are we seeing the end to business as usual and the emergence of a new kind of politics? Because I contend that the answer to the first question doesn't matter unless it can be accompanied by the emergence of a new kind, or what I would call a modern type of politics, modern working practices in politics. So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. So let's just talk about the first question for a second. So when most people talk about the political landscape, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about how many green jerseys and blue jerseys and red jerseys and slightly lighter green jerseys and slightly lighter green jerseys again and slightly darker blue jerseys are there, and critically, who's in power, right? So I put this together, carefully pulled out of Wikipedia, but I coloured in the boxes myself. And what it shows is a classic political cartel and a classic political duopoly. So the state has more or less been run either by Fianna Fáil governments or by Labour Fine Gael governments. And that's pretty much how it's run. And then we've had a little bit of disruption in later years. We had the Greens coming in, we had the PDs in for quite some time. So it's become a little more noisy in recent years. But when you look at this, you might think, well, there's not really a problem here. This looks like the UK, it looks like the US. And it does, but with one very important difference in Ireland, which is in Ireland, unlike in the UK and the US and other countries, we actually don't differentiate between either choices in the duopoly. Now, I've been in politics for about 3.5 years, so I now have a lot of conversations with people about politics and about political parties. And I meet people who identify themselves as staunch Fianna Fáilers and staunch Fine Gaelers. And I don't come from a political family. And I wasn't never in a political party. I always voted for the Green Party in Wicklow because I felt they were probably on to the most important idea out there, and it had to get sorted, and we needed Green Party representation. And, you know, I was always interested in policy, but I was never terribly interested in politics. So now I am talking to a bunch of these people, and you talk to the Fianna Fáil. I said, Fianna Fáil, voted Fianna Fáil all my life. My father, mother voted Fianna Fáil. My grandparents voted Fianna Fáil. I wouldn't speak to a Fine Gaeler. Don't like them. Don't trust them. Nasty bunch. You know the problem with Fine Gaelers is? And so on and so forth. And you get exactly the same thing from the Fine Gaelers. So I wouldn't be talking to those Fianna Fáilers. Bunch of lousers. But what you say to them then is, or what I say to them is, can you give me a single policy difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? One. Right now. And I'd say about 1 in 10 say they can, and about 1 in 20 actually can. So, you know, based on my own story, my own experience, no one can differentiate in policy terms where it kind of matters between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And for those of you who prefer the data to the anecdotes, this is something I pulled off a paper by Liam Weeks, Dr. Liam Weeks. And he was looking at why people vote for independence. I saw this graph and I was very intrigued by this graph. So this graph asks voters in all of these very comparable countries, Belgium, Norway, Poland, the UK, the US and so forth, does it matter who's in power? And what you see is about 15% of most comparable countries, the voters say it doesn't really matter. And the highest it gets to is Belgium on 25%. And then Spain, it's down at about 8%. And in Ireland, it's 50%. And then I read the footnote. And what I found very interesting in this was that the data, the survey was actually taken between 2000 and 2003. So can you imagine, after the last few years and where the public's head is today, what this would look like? I don't know, but I'd say Ireland would probably be up around 75%. Because certainly the reaction that I get now as a politician when I talk to the public and they're reflecting on this government versus the last government is there's no difference, right? And, you know, it's interesting that the late Brian Lenihan in this Dáil used to stand up and would regularly say in his opening speech, I would like to thank the government for continuing to implement Fianna Fáil policy. So I thought this was very interesting in that we have a classic duopoly, but in the minds of many Irish voters, actually it's not a duopoly at all. It's a political monopoly masquerading as some kind of choice. And that may or may not be true, it may or may not be fair, but it's what the public think. So, this is kind of a standard view of the political cartel in Ireland. We had Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, Fianna Fáil traditionally bigger than the other two, Fine Gael traditionally bigger than Labour, very much protected. And then we had a few kind of noisy challengers around the side. And as Frank said, this really is a cartel. It was before the recent changes to political funding, it was really, really difficult to take it on. The barriers to entry put in place by the establishment parties have been put there over the years to stop anybody challenging the cartel, and they're not getting better, they're getting worse. But what's interesting, and the reason everyone is talking about the political landscape and the reason there's a bunch of people doing statistical analysis on what might happen, is because the cartel has messed up the country so spectacularly badly that for a brief moment in time, the political landscape looks a lot more like this. The cartel is under threat. Sinn Féin is on the rise. The more left parties, like the Socialists, People before profit are on the rise. Independents have grown and grown and grown, and there may be new parties. There probably will be new parties. So we're looking for a brief period of time at a more competitive landscape. And I think that's a much healthier landscape. You know, we may end up seeing a more European model, which Theresa and I were discussing just beforehand, which has 4, 5, 6 parties roughly sharing the same amount of seats with genuinely different ideologies. You know, be they social democrat, be they Christian democrat, be they communist, be they neo, whatever it is. We might say, you know what, this might be a more interesting place to do. So, of course, what everybody is doing is they're looking at this and saying, what combination of these groupings is going to have 80 seats in the next Dáil? That's what they think about. And what I want to talk about now is say, okay, that is relevant. Maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not terribly relevant. I hope it is relevant. But the only way it will be relevant is if this new type, this modern type of politics emerges. Now, the note that came with the brochure talked about business as usual in a pejorative sense. The words that got used were cronyism, clientelism, and short-term interests, appealing to the electorate's short-term interests. I would like to reframe that. I think that is harsh, and I think it is unfair on the many men and women who've served in politics, who've served in the public sector, who've served in the private sector, and on the country in general. I would characterise business as usual in Irish politics more like this, right? It is command and control, it is generalist by nature, it is very siloed, and it is very protectionist. And it has been like this forever. And the culture within the Dáil has driven this same culture within the regulators, within the education system, within the healthcare system, and so forth. But we shouldn't be too hard on this, because this is the prevalent culture, this is the prevalent working practices, this was the way of doing business that saw incredible gains in Ireland over the years. In preparation for this, I just did a quick comparison of the 70s to the noughties. And so a few things. So life expectancy between 1975, when I was born, and today has gone up by a decade. That's pretty incredible. In the 1970s, the workforce had about 1 in 4 women working on it. Now it's more than 1 in 2. Higher education, from about the 1970s, there were 26,000 people in Ireland in higher education. And by the noughties, by the year 2000, there was 130,000. Emigration, 1970, 17,000 a year. And by the year 2000, had fallen to just 2,000 a year. Now, obviously, it's gone back up. But I think we should recognise, in saying, look, we've got to move on, I think we need to recognise that we are a damp rock on the side of Europe with no oil and no gold and no diamonds, and we have done spectacularly well. The UN's Human Development Index, put together by a very clever economist called Amartya Sen, which looks not just at GDP per capita, which of course is a proxy for wealth, but looks at education and life expectancy as a more holistic view, ranked Ireland, the last time I checked, about 3rd or 4th in the world. Now, we've fallen a bit, but what an extraordinary thing. And this way of doing business achieved that. So what's the problem? The problem is the rest of the world has moved on. In the 1920s and 30s, the English cottoned on to not letting generalists run things. So before that, someone with a liberal arts degree got to run an engineering firm. And they said, well, maybe we should have engineers running engineering firms. And it worked really well. And in the 70s, Japanese car manufacturers pushed this a lot further and said, well, maybe we should empower our workers. So what they started to do was they said, hey, engineer, you're working down on the line. Why don't you have a think about, and we'll help you and we'll train you and incentivize you, why don't you have a think about making things better where you work? And these working practices have evolved. They've gone from command and control to more distributed and empowered. They've gone from generalist to specialist. They've gone from siloed to joined up. So this kind of buzzword or buzz phrase around interdisciplinary teams. All of that's happening around the world. And they've gone from protectionist to open and accountable. But we haven't here. So when all of this has been happening around the world, and not just in the corporate world, I've done quite a bit of work before I ran for the Dáil. I was working in change management with large organisations outside of Ireland, public sector and private sector organisations. This isn't a reflection of the corporate world. That's not what this is meant to be. This isn't saying public sector bad, corporate sector more evolved. It's saying political and public sector in Ireland is still working to an outdated practice. And a lot of the rest of the world has moved on. Corporate, governance, public sector, and so forth. And in 1999, when we joined the euro, these two cultures collided. And it was then that we finally saw our institutions were not fit for purpose. Our political institution, our central bank, our Department of Finance, and so forth. And it wasn't just in the economics. There's an awful lot of focus on the economic collapse and the fact that we weren't able to deal with all the capital that came in from abroad, and our government was out-negotiated by foreign banks and foreign central banks and foreign governments and foreign corporations, which is true, but there's others. So between 2000 and 2010, Ireland saw the biggest fall in educational standards in the developed world. Now think about that. At a time when money was pouring into the education system, Ireland saw the biggest fall in educational standards measured at 15 years of age in the developed world. So it's not just that others were getting better quicker than we were. We were one of the only countries that was actually going backwards. If you look at our healthcare system, there's some very neat analysis that adjusts our healthcare spend for the fact that we have a really young population, which means that we need to spend much less on healthcare. And what it shows is that Ireland spends the second highest amount per capita on earth on healthcare, when you adjust for the fact that we're younger, and you can be sure that for that we don't get anywhere near the second best healthcare system. Now, you could ask, so what? You know, the Irish Parliament is stuck there. That might be interesting to political correspondents. It might be interesting to people who come to McGill Summer School. It might be interesting to people like me. But ultimately, who cares? Of course, the reason it matters is the people working in this old-style way set the rules for everybody else. And they set the tone, right? So I remember President of, I think it was our Cosgrove, came into an Oireachtas committee, and UCD was falling down the rankings, and he was getting a hard time from all of these TDs. He was, it's terrible business. And he got really annoyed. And he said, you cannot ask me to deliver a world-class university and insist that I can't fire anybody and that I have to pay my best and my worst people the same. He said, that's just a completely unreasonable thing of you to ask. But that's the culture. They're the rules, and that's the tone, and that's what happens. So, all of this was meant to change in the last election. We got the promises.
Sorry, I'm picking your wall.
Oh, thank you. It's a great service. I might have. It's all right. I'm robbing Pat's.
I'm trying to encourage him to go on.
So all of this was meant to change in the last election. Everybody was hopeful. And I remember sitting in the Dáil for my first day. And it was the day that the government was voted in. And I voted for Enda Kenny. You do a walk, and all those who think, he's a terrible man, went right, and all those others went left. There's a few raised eyebrows that I went left. I voted for the man. I remember sitting in the cheap seats, looking across, and I'd read the Fine Gael literature, I'd read the Labour literature. I thought, this is fantastic. We're finally, things have got messed up so badly, we're finally going to start getting things right in this country. And I was full of hope. I was full of optimism. I thought I took these people at their words. I thought they're going to do this. And they didn't. You know, unfortunately. And maybe they tried in some areas, maybe they didn't try in other areas, but the reality is it hasn't happened. And I was talking to a senior civil servant the other day, and we were reflecting on the banking inquiry and me stepping off the banking inquiry and you know, the culture. And he said to me, he said, Fine Gael and Labour have managed to out Fianna Fáil, Fianna Fáil. And I just thought he didn't mean that as a compliment. And of course, the voting public aren't happy about this either. There's a trust barometer done called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it shows that at the start of this year, in January I think it was, the Irish people trusted this government as little as they trusted the Fianna Fáil government just before the 2011 election. Now think about that. We've done, all right. And last year the Edelman barometer showed we were sixth lowest in the countries that they did in terms of public trust in government. This year we're third lowest. So we were bad to begin with, and we're getting worse. So what can be done about this, and why has it not changed? I would posit there's a reason it hasn't changed which nobody is talking about, right? We know the institutions are in a mess and they need to be fixed. And there's loads of brilliant people in there waiting to fix them. And we know that the Dáil and the Seanad are a mess, and there's loads of brilliant people in there waiting to fix them. And we know that the voters are getting really fed up about the fact that nothing's getting fixed, and they're beginning to vote for other people. The reason is because the political parties work in this way too. I bet you, if you dropped a TD from 1940 into the Dáil today, or into a parliamentary party meeting today, he would probably look around and say, what are all these women doing here? But apart from that, I bet he wouldn't see much has changed, right? The parties are being run in the 1920s. So the Dáil is being run in the 1920s. So the public sector has been run in the 1920s is probably a little unfair. I exaggerate for effect. You get my point. It's root cause analysis. In order to modernise the public sector, you've got to modernise Parliament, because we set the rules and the tone. And the only way to modernise Parliament is to modernise the political parties, and that is not happening, and nobody's talking about it. So I'll conclude on this, Pat. I can see you getting fidgety. I want to conclude on this. I'm just going to give four quick examples of how things could be done differently. Right? The first is the good TD Owen Murphy. Now Owen got himself into fierce trouble last year, and many people say that it's one of the reasons he didn't get the nod to a junior ministry, because Owen had the audacity of getting together with 9 other politicians to talk about policy. That's what he did. That was a sin. Now imagine a political party that said, not only is it okay for you guys to meet up for coffee and talk about policy, there is an obligation on you to meet up and talk about policy, and you will be promoted based on talking about policy. The next one is the Finance Committee, which I'm on. Last week we got the budget submissions, and last week, I think it was last Tuesday, Monday or Tuesday, some important groups came in. TAS came in, the Chamber came in, IBEC came in, and there wasn't a single government TD there. Why? Because the government TDs don't input to the budget. So there's no point in being there. We're potentially looking at an election, so they've got election things to do. Now imagine a political party that said, you're on the Finance Committee and we're coming up to the budget, and I'm the Minister for Finance. You are my specialists on the Finance Committee. You need to go and meet all of these groups, and we're going to meet, and by God, if you haven't been at that and you haven't done your homework, you're going to be in trouble. Imagine that kind of political party. The next one is the backbenchers. Is the promotions to the junior ministry. Now, an awful lot of play was made over the 2 ministers not being able to speak Irish, and it even made its way into leaders' questions. And I was sitting there listening to Gerry Adams kind of give out to Enda as Gaeilge, and they had their Gaeilge off. And I reflected, no one is asking if any of the other Minister of States have any relevant experience in what they've just been promoted to. Now imagine a political party that went out and recruited candidates based on having a nice range of specialism, and then put them in as seconds to the ministers so that they could learn on the job, and we got some succession planning, and then they got promoted to these kind of jobs. You know, like I say, the English stopped doing what we're doing now in the 1920s. And then finally, we have a bunch of TDs and senators who were kicked out of their party for having the audacity to vote on an issue of conscience. Now, regardless of what one believes, my understanding is that there's no other developed democracy on earth would have kicked them out. Now, imagine a party that says, we will apply the whip where it has to be applied, but you can vote. We expect you to think for yourself from time to time. And I was just reflecting, the one bit I wrote down where I would disagree with Frank, when he talked about independence. He talked about the tension and the impossibility or the difficulty of independence getting together. And the two words I wrote down were independence and discipline. And this, to me, is the mistake, is that discipline, party discipline, means no one is allowed to think in an independent way and act in an independent way and improve things locally in an independent way. And that's the problem. That's the break. You can have discipline and empowerment and independence at the same time. The best public sector organisations in the world do. The best corporations in the world do. And we can do it here. So, I'll finish on this. We come back here. The McGill Summer School says, without fundamental reform of our politics and institutions, can we meet the challenges ahead? The answer is an unambiguous no. So we have got to modernise, and we've got to start with the parties, be it the existing parties or be it new parties. New parties who think in that way and act in that way, and existing parties that can change in that way, will inevitably modernise the Oireachtas. And a modernised Oireachtas will inevitably modernise the regulators, the healthcare system, the education system and so forth. So that's the battle. It's between politicians who want things to stay the same, and whilst we all talk about things changing, judge people on their actions. And when you judge people on their actions, there's a whole lot of politicians who have no interest in anything changing. And then I think there's a growing number of politicians who do want things to change and who do want things to modernise and who can imagine political parties working in different ways. That, to me, is just as interesting and important as the struggle about what colour the jerseys are in the next stall. Thank you.